All right, folks, here comes another video for you. This one is just a practical one. It doesn't get into any really big ideas. The point is, I just want you to see how t-tests appear in articles, and I'll give you a little guidance on how to read articles just in general. Turns out that most statistical analyses, including the ones that we'll study this term and a lot of others that we won't have time to get into, are all pretty much produced in the same way or written about in the same way. And a couple of years ago, I came up with this thing I call the results cycle. That is my term, and I keep waiting for it to take off, but it never does. It's not even on Urban Dictionary yet. But the idea is that the results cycle is a way to help you, as you learn to read articles, reminds you what to pay attention to. And then soon you'll have to write some statistical reports on your own, and it'll help you write that as well. So it'll tell you what to look for in an article, and I'll define it real quick, and then we'll walk through an example from a fairly straightforward study that I think it'll help you figure this out. At the end of the term, what you'll find is that you probably don't remember how to conduct all the analyses that we do, but you'll remember enough about them to where when you read an article and use the results cycle, you'll be able to make sense of them. And that's probably the main goal of the course anyway. So let's get started here. Let me tell you about the results cycle in general. First of all, in scientific articles, there's a subheading. There are several different sections, and there's one of them called results. And the results comes after they've told you all about their ideas and hypotheses, after they tell you about how they set up their study and conducted it. Then there's a results section, and they describe what they found. Following that, there's a discussion section where they talk about the implications of it. So the results section is really just what the data showed and what the tests tell us about the data. And the heavy stuff comes a little bit later. And any results section, there's going to be a set of 5 things that the author will need to write and the reader needs to read and think about. And the results cycle just highlights those 5 things for us. It's called a cycle because most of the time in any experiment that you do, you're going to wind up testing more than one thing. And so you'll have to identify those 5 things for each of the tests that you do. So you kind of cycle through it several times. The example I have today actually did 3 tests, and we're going to look at 2 of them because 2 of them were t-tests. All right, so the very first thing is, in the results section, the author will tell you what the concept is, what they are testing. It will say something about the variables in this test. Now, in the introduction to the paper, they describe this in several pages sometimes, and they will describe the variables in the method section. So here are the results. We're talking about a sentence, maybe 2, that you need to look at, and it'll remind you of what they set up earlier. Number 3 is the statistical procedures. So far, we've learned about things like means, standard deviations, confidence intervals, z-test, and the one sample t-test. In the example I'm using, they're doing a version of the t-test that we haven't yet looked at. We'll probably look at that tomorrow. The results of it involve 3 things. A statement about statistical significance, and that means basically statistical significance is when you reject the null hypothesis and you say that the group means are actually different. There are some descriptive statistics so you can kind of get a sense for how different they are. So you can see the mean of one group and the mean of the other group. And then in APA style manuscripts, you will see the result written in a certain way. So APA style, the APA is the largest organization of psychologists, and they publish a lot of journals, so they have their own style manual. It's used a lot in other disciplines as well. So I've published articles in communication sciences and education and linguistics, and I just kind of fall back on that. You'll see the different styles, and that would be like, using italics or not, using a comma or a semicolon. The different styles really don't have a huge impact because regardless of the journal, you will see similar information presented. So, finally, there's a brief statement about what the result of the test means. And keep in mind that the results section is just telling you what the data show. There's usually a section that follows that talks more deeply about the implications of it. All right, so those are the 5 things for each test, and it's a cycle because most studies will go through that more than once with various tests. All right, so, excuse me, let's take a look here at an example. Let me give you some background on this. This is an undergraduate paper from an undergraduate journal about 15 years ago, and the author was studying the incidence of negative eating patterns and eating attitudes amongst women, college women in Greek sorority groups. And the idea is to try to understand if there are risk factors associated with membership in one of those groups. She had a really nice introduction that explained why she thought that might be worth looking at. And so the methods section described exactly how she gathered responses from individuals, how many people she had, their ages, and things like that. So here in the results cycle, now she just stops and says, okay, here's what I've tested and here's what I've found. So the first part of the results cycle, you'll see that she wrote here that her hypothesis was that sorority women would have higher conformity scores. And the variables then would be conformity scores and if someone was in a sorority or not. Now the method section will tell you some of those things too. Because I've already read that, let me back up, because I had already read that, this is just my reminder of something I read before. I guess this is a good point for me to stop and say you shouldn't start an article at the results section. By the time you get here, you should just see these as reminders. Yeah. So this concept or hypothesis is that sorority women would have higher conformity scores. I know from the method section that she compared members of a sorority to independent college women at the same school. She measured conformity using a scale, so I can remember that. Next step in the results cycle is what procedures? Well, she used something called a one-tailed independent groups t-test. We haven't actually studied that yet, but as I was saying earlier, once you know a little bit about significance tests, you don't need to know every single type. We will, in fact, learn how to do this later this week. Independent samples t-test. 4, what are the results? This involves a statement about significance, some descriptive statistics, and it should be an APA style section where it tells you the t-test. So what I see here is that the mean conformity score for sorority women, there's the mean, and in parentheses, standard deviation. The conformity score for non-sorority members was 5.85, and there's the standard deviation. And here's a statement about significance. A significant difference was found between sorority and non-sorority member scores on the cooperativeness scale. That's how she measured it. And this is the APA style thing I was mentioning. In APA style, you write the T with an italics, the degrees of freedom. And because I know about the type of test she did, an independence group t-test, I know that she had 38 women in her study. We'll learn about that later. The t-value was 1.83, and the p-value associated with that is less than 0.038. Now, she didn't have to tell me this, but I'm pretty sure she used an alpha of 0.05, and the p-value is less than 0.05. And so I know that that makes this a statistically significant result. And that p-value is less than alpha, it's statistically significant. The very last thing is just a brief statement in English about what it means. Notice that that's built in here. She said which group scored higher than the other group by providing us with means. For sorority women, it was in the 8s. For non-sorority, it was in the 5s. So when she says there's a difference, that's cool, but then she also lets me know which group scores higher than the other. Now, what are the implications and the limitations? That comes a little bit later. All I know is that with the sample that she had, this group scored fairly high compared to this group. And that's a statistically significant difference. All right, it's a results cycle. Guess what? She had a third hypothesis in the study. What concept is being tested? Can you see it? There it is. Sorority women would score higher on the EDI. Now, when I read the method section, she defined this. She's measuring attitudes about eating, and this stands for the Eating Disorders Inventory. The Eating Disorders Inventory is one of those self-report scales where the women in the survey would identify statements, and then they'd say whether they would disagree on a scale. So the hypothesis is that it would score higher on that scale. I see my independent variable is whether they're in the sorority. The EDI is the dependent variable. What statistical procedures? Again, she used a one-tailed independent groups t-test. What were the results? Well, the mean EDI scores, the eating disorder inventory scores for women, that was in the 50s, whereas the mean score for non-sorority women was 31. See the standard deviations there. It says it was a significant difference. That's our statement of significance. The descriptive statistics here let me see exactly how far apart they are. And then the t-value here, t with 36 degrees of freedom is 1.78, and the p-value is less than 0.042. There it says it's less than 0.05, so I know it's statistically significant. And the brief statement in English of what this tells us, well, that's kind of built in there. Sorority scores were higher than non-sorority scores. And there you have it. So those are the 5 things that you need to look for anytime you read about a hypothesis test in a journal article. I've uploaded a journal article assignment, and it will include both the PDF copy of a published article and a Microsoft Word document that has a set of questions, and it will hopefully guide you through the article in a way that makes sense to you. That'll be due next week, and please let me know in advance by email if you have some questions. Give me some time to respond to everyone's questions about that. But I would say just kind of take it easy, look at the Word doc, and I think this first article usually works out pretty well for people. I do have to say that normally we've gone over this in class a couple times before people read that first article, and we're doing this in a very weird way, but let's hope for the best.